Welcome, everyone, to the Fantasy and Betting Podcast presented by the 33rd Team. I'm your host, as always, Josh Larky, joined as always by my co-host, Ryan Reynolds. We're going to be recapping the Week 10 action with an eye, looking ahead towards Week 11. First off, though, there are 4 teams on bye for Week 11. We have the Atlanta Falcons. Let's check in on that quarterback room that Ryan and I have notably disliked. This quarterback room combined for 94 total passing yards against the Cardinals this past Sunday. Desmond Ridder, Taylor Heineke, clearly not the answer with all of those weapons. Arthur Smith being exposed now on a weekly basis. The Falcons started off strong, had bad opponents, but now they sit at 4-6, deservedly so. We also have the Colts on bye, and Jonathan Taylor is starting to look like a sneaky league winner. Ryan and I have been pretty bullish on him the last few weeks. He's now taking over almost all the work from Zach Moss. 18 and 23 carries the past 2 weeks. He has run 43 routes over the past 2 weeks to Zach Moss's 6. And we love that Colts playoff schedule. I know Ryan's been banging the drum for that Week 17 game against the Raiders, but even before that, Week 15 against the Steelers. So we have Steelers Week 15, Raiders Fantasy Championship Week 17. Both those teams are top 8 in yards per carry allowed to running backs, and top 8 in fantasy points allowed to running backs as well. And then Week 16 with the Falcons, they've been fairly stingy this year against running backs, but I think we'd all agree this is a team in decline and should not in any way be a scary matchup. The Saints, the bye came at the perfect time. Saints fans, congratulations. If you were going to choose a week for the bye, it probably would be this one. Derek Carr's concussed. He re-hurt his shoulder. Michael Thomas and Marshawn Lattimore, the receiver and the cornerback, both suffered serious multi-week injuries in that game as well. The final team on bye is the Patriots, who we will discuss later on in the show. Ryan, I'm going to turn it over to you now. Let's start running through some of these Week 11 matchups.
We have a pretty average week, bookended by 2 wonderful matchups. The first one starts on Thursday Night Football, Ravens versus Bengals. Ravens are 3.5-point home favorites. The game total's already risen from 43.5 to 46. You know, Josh, we've been talking about Lamar Jackson a lot recently. Sports betting's built on a lot of who's overvalued, who's undervalued. For weeks, people, we talked about this. Lamar Jackson, this wonderful passer, blah, 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 where it's, I guess, very efficient, great athlete, former MVP, guy's awesome, but let's stop comparing them to, the elite passers in the league because the volume's just not there, and volume matters to at least some extent. On the same token, let's not overreact to a rough game against the Browns defense last week. Lamar Jackson's still who he is, MVP candidate, MVP contender pretty much every year that he's healthy. Let's go into this week with an open mind. Whoever actually wins this game, be it Jackson's Ravens or Burrow's Bengals, the quarterback's going to rise in the MVP race. Who do you got? What kind of thoughts do you have on the Ravens offense here, Josh?
So we'll see what happens over the next day or two with practice reports. I'm going to guess T. Higgins misses this game as well. It's a short week. The hamstrings usually are multi-week absence. Tyler Boyd led this team with a 31% target share yesterday. He caught 8 of 12 for 117 yards. I think he's at the very least flexible again should T. Higgins miss. It's a tough matchup, but I know you want to continue to bet on this Bengals pass attack. Burrow is now hit in fantasy 3 straight weeks. One question I have for you is, how did you think he looked yesterday? Because the raw stats were very, very strong for Burrow, but he had a pretty miserable success rate. In essence, Burrow got there in fantasy and real life from a few big plays, but that the average drive was not all that pretty for the Bengals yesterday.
Yeah, I mean, the deep shot he threw to Chase while evading to his left is a throw that, maybe 10 people in the history of the world, would make the way that he did, made it look easy. So he's back. That's still the narrative. That's still the reality situation. But I would say that, threatening the guys like Trenton Irwin and having to rely on Tyler Boyd at this point in his career, definitely less efficient and definitely less ceiling than we would have liked, which is why I thought the Texans were dangerous in survivor pools last week.
And then on the Ravens end, I'm not selling high on Keaton Mitchell. He had the 9 carries for 138 yards and a touchdown in week 9. Then he outtouches Justice Hill in week 10. Just 3 carries, 34 yards and a touchdown on the ground. Caught 1 of 2 targets for 32 yards. You might be like, that back-to-back games at double-digit yards per carry. We're selling, right? And the way that I see it is that he's already jumped Justice Hill. I don't think Gus Edwards is insurmountable. Edwards is probably always going to be the touchdown guy, but you're not really getting much right now for Keaton Mitchell. And if there's any chance that you can get a reliable weekly fantasy producer out of him, when he plays on the Ravens offense, and we should bet on speed attached to Lamar Jackson in the run game. I would simply just hold and ride it out. He's probably not going to be consistently startable, but it's not like you're getting a fantasy RB2 in return in any trade. So I think he is a pretty firm hold. And then I'll also say that I'm still working on these fantasy play caller rankings. And like I mentioned last week, the Ravens are going to be a lot lower on that list than people expect.
That's Larky tweets. He dives into all the numbers for every offensive player every week so that you don't have to. Keep an eye out for his fantasy rankings on the website that will come out on Tuesday afternoons. Next up, Josh, less attractive game by a long shot. Panthers versus Cowboys. Panthers are 11-point home underdogs. Game totals went up slightly already from 41.5 points to 42.5. From the Panthers side, and we talked to Jordan Vanek about this yesterday, what I've seen with Bryce Young for most of the season is there's not a lot there on a lot of the plays. And I think the trauma of that, and I've seen, this happens with young quarterbacks a lot, the gradual trauma of not being in an NFL game, the speed's higher than it was in college. Your supporting cast is worse than it was, and there's nothing there. Even when there is something there now, he's starting to freeze up a little bit, lock up a little bit. So I hope that's not a long-term thing. But at this point, the Panthers are an extremely unreliable offense, and they're not that great on defense either. Do you have any positives or anything useful for fantasy managers from the Panthers, Josh?
Yeah, so I'll start with a negative, and then we'll hit a positive. A negative on Thursday night, Bryce Young and Tyson Bagent were pretty indistinguishable when you look at the stats. Identical 4.9 yards per pass attempt. The average depth of target was 6.8 for Young, 6.7 for Bagent. And Young is the one that threw 3 interceptions. So not much there. The one positive is that Miles Sanders might not be dead. I understand he had negative rushing yards, but the actual split was almost even in terms of snaps. Chuba outcarried him 9-2, but Sanders actually ran 19 routes to Chuba's 13. We talked about it last week, and I was like, Chuba's the lead back there, but it's a very tenuous situation. And no way would I bet that he's the lead back rest of season. And I think we started to see that just a little bit. So I would just caution anyone who's dropping Miles Sanders. I would scoop them up if I were in your league. And I would definitely consider selling Chuba Hubbard. So there we go. That's a little positive for the Panthers. Miles Sanders might still be alive.
For the Cowboys, 5 blowout wins now. Your big concern here is that desperate teams like Carolina can sometimes surge in these spots at home. That said, Dak Prescott's been on a tear for 4 or 5 weeks now. I said it was Tony Pollard last week, and it was not Tony Pollard week. I think going forward, we have to be very concerned now. If you can't 60-ish yards against the Giants in a blowout win is not even, Doolittle actually outperformed them to a degree too, more explosive than them even maybe. That said, Josh, the Cowboys can beat you in a number of ways. Again, Prescott's playing well. The defense is lights out. They're in a smash spot against the Panthers again this week. Give us your thoughts on Dallas.
Yeah, we've talked for a few weeks about how it's an ascending pass attack, and I think they're actually the perfect example of, you and I talk a lot about how we want to sell low and buy high. And a lot of people, they don't like that. They're like, no, you should do it the opposite. The thing is, you can't really do that. If a player stinks, you can't suddenly be like, oh, I'm sure there's somebody out there who loves this guy. The idea is that you want to buy the ascending players that keep ascending. And we talked about that with Dak and CeeDee Lamb. Here we are now, a few weeks later, 25 or more fantasy points in 4 straight games for Dak. CeeDee Lamb just became the first player in NFL history to have at least 10 catches and 150 receiving yards in 3 straight games. Obviously, we didn't expect that, but that's kind of the idea behind, we want to buy high. We see the Cowboys starting to ascend. We buy high. Pollard, we've talked for a few weeks as they sell low. And a lot of people really didn't like to hear that. And I'm like, all right, cool. You still have 20 Pollard. Do you wish you sold him a few weeks ago? I would certainly assume so. Like you mentioned, Rico Dowdle actually out only a couple fewer carries, but actually had more rushing yards, looked more explosive. I think it's all bad news at this point for Pollard. And just another reminder, does get the Lions in week 17, who have generally been a pretty stingy run defense. So Pollard is really not someone you want on your fantasy rosters.
Yeah, one of your better calls entering the season, Josh. You were lower than him on consensus by a good bit. That's definitely aged very, very well. Next up, Josh, Dolphins versus Raiders. Dolphins are coming off a bye. They're 11-point home favorites. Game total's 48. Miami shredded bad teams this year, and I'd still call the Raiders a bad team. wonderful. You beat the two worst offenses in the league in the last 2 weeks. I'm not, that doesn't concern me at all. My biggest concern on the Dolphins' offensive front is Max Crosby could create havoc all on his own to this degree. And the Dolphins' offense is a lot about timing. So if he can disrupt Tua a little bit, that's the Dolphins' path to falling under expectations here. What do you got on Miami's offense, Josh?
Yeah, what we've seen with Miami is that it's a historic offense against bad teams and league average type against good teams. I think the Raiders qualify as a bad team here. I'm firing up all Dolphins players. Devon Achane should be returning this week. He looks like a true fantasy RB1 each and every week. So I have zero concerns at this point. You give the Dolphins a bye. You just had the Raiders playing on primetime. I feel quite good about the Dolphins offense in this one.
One thing I'll say for the Raiders over the last 2 weeks, again, not too enthusiastic about the wins. The Giants, Tommy DeVito's Giants, we'll get into them later, the worst team in recent memory. The Jets offense is so bad that it hurts their defense, but the game plans have been good on offense. They've clearly went out of their way to get Devontae Adams involved. That said, Josh, 11 points is a weird line. I think Vegas gets smashed here. You have any thoughts on the Raiders?
Yeah, I think they should switch back to Jimmy Garoppolo.
Yeah.
I mean, Aiden O'Connell's not the answer. I'm really not sure why you don't at least let Jimmy continue playing for a watchable product. And we're not really big Josh Jacobs guys in fantasy football. And I think it's a good time to just sell him. I don't want to see any more. He has 53 carries over the last 2 weeks. And he has been the RB7 per game over these past 2 weeks, even with 2 touchdowns. So you're really banking on him continuing to have a Derrick Henry type workload just to have RB7 per game production with the touchdowns also coming. That's a lot that we have to get right each and every week. And I don't want to be starting Josh Jacobs anymore in fantasy football.
I'm with you there on the Garoppolo front. I think, the team's 5-5. I think they're going to pay for the decision to move to O'Connell this week against the Dolphins. Next up, Lions versus Bears. Lions were 9-point favorites yesterday. They're 10-point favorites today. Game total still 46.5 points. Detroit has an offense that can be massively productive in both phases. We saw that against the Chargers in one game last week. Jared Goff can torch you for 300 in the air. They have 2 running backs now that can absolutely eviscerate you in both phases, particularly Gibbs as a pass catcher. Defense has been shredded by above average offenses now. They've played 3 times now. They've been torched by quality offenses. So that's something to keep an eye on. You have any thoughts on the Lions here, Josh?
Yeah, I think with Jahmyr Gibbs, what we saw was the coming out party this past week. I wasn't really sold on him those first 2 performances without Montgomery. I was like, guys, the first week without Montgomery, they're down 28-0 at halftime to the Ravens, and then he gets 10 targets. We love that for Gibbs. And then the next game, he faces the Raiders team that after that game fires the head coach, the GM, the offensive coordinator, and benches their quarterback. But what we saw against the Chargers, I think, was so encouraging that I'm no longer in the camp of wary on Gibbs. I'm actually wary on Montgomery. Gibbs outcarried him 14-12. He outsnapped him 37-24. He ran twice as many routes. Gibbs had 5 targets. Montgomery had none. Goal line carries, Montgomery had 2, but Gibbs had 3. Gibbs looks awesome when you look at usage, and he just is clearly the more explosive player. I would sell high on David Montgomery, who had 12 carries, 116 yards, and a touchdown. We might be looking at the best fantasy performance of him rest of season if this split continues. And I think at this point, how do you not keep Gibbs as the lead back here?
Fair question, Josh. The Bears side of things, the Bears defense has been scrappy for over a month now. Montez Sweat is one of the reasons where I don't really care about pressure statistics. You can argue about the deal and the contract. That's fine. No problem there. But he's fundamentally changed the Bears front over the last 2 weeks already. Badgin's done a pretty solid job as a backup. Not really awe-inspiring, but he's been solid for the most part. That said, if Fields returns for this game, the Bears actually have a really interesting ceiling on offense. I think of all the big favorites this week, the Lions are in the most danger of losing if Fields is active. What do you think about the Bears offense, especially if Fields comes back, Josh?
Yeah, I'd be pretty optimistic about this offense should Fields return. Looks like Khalil Herbert will also return at running back. The thing I'm actually most interested in for fantasy is this backfield. Deonta Foreman's performed pretty well these last 2 weeks. He has at least 20 carries in each game. Khalil Herbert, there's no way he doesn't return when he was basically a full practice participant last week. It's almost as if they knew they could beat the Panthers on Thursday night without him, which congrats, you did it. I think he returns this week, but I'm starting to think it's going to be a pretty muddy backfield. I don't think Herbert played well enough before his injury to just get it back. And I don't think Deonta Foreman makes sense for this roster as a guy that's just the lead back every single week, just an older veteran. So I'm actually kind of not excited about any of these running back options. I think with the Bears, mentioned it last week, I still think Justin Fields is a great buy in redraft. And I'm still very, very optimistic about DJ Moore in this matchup and rest of season.
Next up, Browns versus Steelers. Browns were 3.5-point home favorites yesterday. They're 4-point favorites today. Game totals went down from 38.5 to 37. The game against Baltimore was a weird game. Baltimore led 31-17 late. Cleveland came back and won 33-31. Very strange game. The thing that I find interesting is Deshaun Watson's still not consistent, but at least he's making plays. And we've been talking about this for weeks, Josh. If the Browns can get anything resembling even stable quarterback play, or, even a guy who can make plays, Cleveland's a genuine contender. Where are you at on the Browns offense right now?
So with the Browns offense, the one guy that I'm excited about is David Njoku. Right now, everyone out there in fantasy world is trying to buy Dalton Kincaid and Trey McBride, and maybe TJ Hawkinson after yesterday. But David Njoku, we already know he's a great athlete. And one thing that we finally seen is that the usage is sort of matching the athleticism and the excitement that we've had about him for, at this point, over a half decade. Target share has been over 21%, 4 straight games now. And what I like is that they're actually just manufacturing quick touches for him. I think a lot of that is that they really just don't fully trust Deshaun Watson still. And you just see a lot of these first down plays. It's like, all right, just swing it out to Njoku, let him try and break a tackle, see what happens. Very good for Njoku, especially in PPR formats. He's also been so ridiculously involved when they get into scoring range. 10 red zone targets and 4 end zone targets his past 4 games. And then if we look at the playoff schedule, it's actually very, 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 very friendly for Njoku. He gets the Bears week 15, the Texans week 16, both top 4 fantasy matchups for tight ends. And then week 17, the Jets. You and I couldn't be more pessimistic about this game environment overall. A bad weather Cleveland game with Zach Wilson and Deshaun Watson, who doesn't have a particularly strong arm either. But Jets are a tight end funnel defense. They are exactly middle of the road against tight ends for fantasy, but they are the worst matchup for receivers. And you're probably going to want to start Njoku in that matchup. So I think if you kind of miss out on the rising Kincaid and McBride, Njoku looks like the consolation prize for fantasy football.
As Larky tweets, his rest of season rankings will be out on Wednesday, along with his trade calculator. The Steelers side of things, Josh, I haven't looked at passing charts yet. I usually do that on Wednesdays, but I don't think Kenny Pickett threw a ball on the seam. I don't think he threw a ball in the middle of the field the whole game last week. Team continues to be an average offense away from being a perennial playoff contender, but they're still not there. It's still early in Kenny Pickett's career, but at some point we got to tip the hourglass over and start asking ourselves, like, what's the solution here in Pittsburgh? What are your thoughts on the Steelers offense, Josh?
Ryan, Kenny Pickett has been miserable for fantasy. One of my worst calls this year was liking Kenny Pickett as a late round quarterback, but I think it made sense. Mobility, a lock on the starting job, which we've seen this year. He has not played well, and he's still the starter. And the supporting cast is decent. Deontay Johnson, George Pickens, that's a pretty solid wide receiver duo. But this will surprise some people. Kenny Pickett's 2-year start to his career has been worse in fantasy football than Zach Wilson. Kenny Pickett, through 21 starts, has never reached 20 fantasy points. You don't want him in best ball. You can't start him in redraft. Zach Wilson reached 20 fantasy points multiple times as a rookie and in year 2. Again, Kenny Pickett, 21 starts in year 2, yet to reach 20 fantasy points. He's holding back everyone in this offense. And I think if the Steelers are smart, they just move on from him after this year. Because I think what we're seeing at this point for people out there that are like, well, they're 6-3. We are getting the most replacement level type production from Kenny Pickett, maybe below replacement level at times, and they are still 6-3. Mike Tomlin is an absolute genius. He's working wonders, I do not want to see another Kenny Pickett season at this point for fantasy, for real life. Otherwise, Kenny Smallhands looks like a career backup quarterback.
Yeah, the one thing I'll say there is the Steelers are definitely have the most inflated record in the league right now, and it's tough to say that because Tomlin is a big reason why they're as consistent as they are, but they definitely need more out of their offense if that's going to continue. Next up, Josh, Texans versus Cardinals. This game was Texans -5 yesterday. Today they're 4-point home favorites. Game total slightly down from 48.5 to 48 on the dot. I hate to say this, Josh, but I think Jason Garrett nailed this on the halftime show at Sunday Night Football yesterday. The efficiency of lack of turnovers for CJ Stroud have been great, impressive beyond belief. The 2 big spike weeks, even more impressive. But for me, the poise, the maturity, and how Stroud seems to be unfazed this early in his career what impressed me the most. I compared him to Dak Prescott entering the year. I think he's already better than that, which is almost crazy to say because Dak's the line of, is your quarterback great or is he very good? I think Dak's the line. I think Stroud's at least flirting with crossing that line already. He threw a late interception last week. He bounced back, quick memory like a closer in baseball. Very, very impressive. That makes Houston a dangerous team going forward. I was high on Singletary last week. Haven't been high on him otherwise for the whole year. I would personally take his production last week with a grain of salt, but I'm very curious to hear what your thoughts are on the Texans offense, Josh.
Yeah, I think what we've seen at this point is that CJ Stroud is, I wouldn't say he's there yet, but he's looking like he has shades of the Patrick Mahomes, Aaron Rodgers fantasy football elevator. One thing that I loved was that anyone that plays with Mahomes, with Rodgers, it elevates their fantasy points. Doesn't really matter who's playing receiver, tight end, what the offensive line looks like. You always have a shot for solid fantasy production. We are seeing that with CJ Stroud. Over 9 yards per attempt against the Bengals. 356 passing yards. He hung 30 points against them. That's the first time this year the Bengals allowed 30 points. He did this on the road, again, without Nico Collins. I think in Dynasty, every single Texans player there for multiple years is a buy. In redraft as well, I think we should be very excited just to continue to start all these Texans players. And we've talked about this before when you're like, I've got a flex decision to make. Let me just go with the good offense. I think if you have a flex decision to make and you're looking at like a Noah Brown type or someone that is in any way associated with this Texans offense, that should be one of your tiebreakers at this point. So very, very hard to find that. And I think Stroud at this point is one of the 5 best in the NFL at maximizing, at the very least, the fantasy points and the raw aggregate production of everyone surrounding him.
I love your thought process there because the guy I was thinking of was Peyton Manning. I don't want to compare CJ Stroud to Peyton Manning at all, but as a talent elevator, Marvin Harrison, Reggie Wayne, cool. I'll make you Hall of Famers. But Brandon Stokely, Peyton Manning makes that guy a guy who has 1,000 yards receiving. That's what Noah Brown's situation reminding me of. Noah Brown played with a pretty good quarterback in Dak Prescott, and he looks like a world beater in Houston. Obviously, Nico Collins doesn't matter like we thought he did early in the season. Tank Dell's the most explosive player, but again, Stroud's elevating everyone. He does not have a great supporting cast. If you're a Texans fan, you have to be absolutely thrilled right now. The Cardinals side of things, Josh, it's kind of crazy that Kyler Murray is coming off a torn ACL. Some of the plays he made in pressure management, like his speed's still there, his elusiveness is still there. I've always liked him as more as a talent than most people. I think he's special. I remember writing in my notes that Aaron Rodgers is the only quarterback that I liked more coming out of college, Kyler Murray. And to that end, Josh, obviously Trey McBride was a big winner yesterday, but it's only been 1 game. What are your thoughts on the Cardinals offense moving forward?
Ryan, I am going to buy low again on Marquise Brown. This is the one receiver I'll just keep pounding the table for. 4 targets. He only catches 1 for 28 yards. But I think what's more encouraging is that Kyler Murray was back and looked very, very healthy. Marquise Brown has been his guy. I think will continue to be his guy. And then I would also try and acquire James Conner before your trade deadlines. The role was awesome. Almost every single touch went to him in this backfield. He only had 7 fantasy points. I think that will change in future weeks. And we talked about this on our rest of season show this past Thursday, that the line of running backs you feel comfortable starting each and every week, where there's at least some kind of baseline floor along with baseline touches. Conner is kind of that line. Now that we're preparing for the fantasy playoffs, if you have 7, 6, 8 wins in your league, players like James Conner are exactly the type that you should be looking to acquire. If you realize that you look like you have a long-term hole at the RB2 slot, Connor, kind of the cheapest option that I'd feel very comfortable just throwing in there each and every week.
I like that, Josh. I like that. Next up.
Now, I was going to say,
Okay.
I think before we continue, we should talk about the Patriots.
Okay.
I'll give Ryan a little break to collect himself. We talked about how the Patriots are on bye. Now, Ryan's watched every snap of every game since 2014. I don't really know anyone that's more psychotic in the best way possible about football consumption, understanding what it takes to win. And right now, one thing I've seen is the media is pounding the fire Bill Belichick drum. If you just do a simple Google search of Bill Belichick, all you see are where should he coach next year? Why he should be fired. And at face value, it makes sense. The Patriots have scored the second fewest points this year. Only the New York Giants have scored fewer. Only 6 teams have allowed more points to opponents this year than the Patriots. So their defense can't stop anyone. Their offense can't score. Since 2020, without Tom Brady, the Patriots are 27-33. Ryan, what would you say, I guess, let's pretend I'm the media and I say we should fire Bill Belichick. Let's hear, I'm sure your very calm response to this one.
Yeah, I don't really like this subject too much because, let's start with this, Josh. First, Bill Belichick's a 71-year-old man who's holding 2 executive-level jobs for a multi-billion-dollar organization where every decision he makes consumed by the public. I mean, maybe no one on the history of the planet's or let's say very few people in the history of the planet are even capable of trying that. So that's step one for me. Maybe at this point he should get a little help in the front office because I think the problem's the roster, and he's definitely part of that problem. So I don't really have any arguments with that. But before, from a legacy standpoint, he made a lot of good moves throughout this century that helped this team win. The idea that he's riding Tom Brady's coattails literally drives me insane. And let's just run through a few things here, Josh. New England hasn't had a top 5 pick in the entire century. They've had 2 top 10 picks in the entire century. Since Brady left, they've gone 8-9, 10-7, 8-9. Those records are a miracle considering the talent on this roster. Now this year things are going sideways. Obviously, they're 2-5 in 1-score games. The blowout against Dallas was really bad. The game against New Orleans was probably the most bizarre game I watched all year. But they've been in games a lot, and the defense has driven the show for the most part. A lot of injuries on defense. I'll also admit this too. My first bet that I ever made was on the Patriots to win the Super Bowl the year they won their first one before the season started at 100-1 odds. So always a Belichick guy for that. I'm also a Giants fan. Belichick's game plan against the Bills in the Super Bowl is literally in the Hall of Fame because he created a new defense for Jim Kelly's offense. Basically, invited them to run the ball against them. Beat the greatest show on turf in that Super Bowl I just mentioned before. Defense drove the show there. Beat Jared Goff's Rams in the Super Bowl 13-3. That's not a Tom Brady win. That's a defensive win. And the big one here, Josh, and I think this is the one that drives me the craziest, is the difference between Peyton Manning and Tom Brady is Bill Belichick. If you ask Peyton Manning what his career would have looked like if Bill Belichick was his coach his whole career, he'd give you a very fascinating answer. And the other thing is, the league literally changed the rules for what defensive backs could do to wide receiver because of what Belichick did to the Colts for so many years. So the other thing is, in his one game against Brady scored 19 points with an all-star team. Just maybe, I don't think he should be pulling double duty anymore for his own benefit even, but the idea of wanting this guy to get fired for really having the first truly bad season of his career with the Patriots is absolutely insane to me.
Guys, that rant was brought to you by Ryan Reynolds NFL on Twitter. The better, more famous, more intelligent, more football savvy Ryan Reynolds. His power rankings hit the site, the33rdteam.com on Tuesdays. Today, Monday, his survivor picks for the week come out and his thoughts on that. Thursdays, his expert picks and predictions come out. And on Saturdays, he lets you know what he's betting on in each and every game. You need to be reading Ryan's work because, quite simply, nobody talks about football in the way that Ryan does.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be interesting to see, with Belichick too, who's going to be better than him. And I mean, the Eagles had this problem with Andy Reid. The grass was not greener when they did that. This reminds me of that situation a little bit. Now, next up, Josh, Jaguars versus Titans. Jaguars are 6.5-point home favorites. Game totals 40 points. There's no shame in getting beat up by the 49ers. The Cowboys got eviscerated by the 49ers. It doesn't make them a bad team. Jacksonville ran into a buzzsaw a little bit here too because the 49ers were on a 3-game losing streak coming off their bye. That said, Josh, in my power rankings, I'm going to have the Texans ahead of the Jaguars, and it's not because they beat them earlier in the year. It's because Stroud's outplaying Trevor Lawrence. Trevor Lawrence has the capability to be an elite quarterback, but so far this year, that has not been a consistent thing at all. Good opportunity here against the Titans this week for that change. What are your thoughts on the Jaguars offense?
Yeah, I think with the Jaguars offense, it just goes back to Trevor Lawrence. We just haven't seen we saw the step forward last year. We haven't really seen that this year. It's kind of been a lateral or down step, if anything. You inject Calvin Ridley into this offense, and not much has happened. Still yet to reach 20 fantasy points in a game. He has 2 games with 2 touchdown passes. The other 7, he had 0 or 1. And when we look at the teams that the Jaguars have beat, I think we could say the most impressive win was the Bills. But then we remember that this was historic because no team had played back-to-back games in London like the Jaguars. So the Jaguars essentially were acclimated to the time difference. They were used to London. The Bills come out a couple days before the game. And kind of predictably, the Bills didn't play as well as many expected, simply because the time difference. Anyone that's ever traveled with 8 hours of time difference, the last thing you want to do a day or two in is participate in athletic competitions. I can tell you the time that I went to Europe to study abroad, the last thing I wanted to do when I got there was take a test or do an athletic competition. I wanted a couple days to just relax and recoup. So at this point, I have not seen a single game from the Jaguars that made me think this is truly a Super Bowl contender type team.
Yeah, I think they're going to end up with an inflated schedule. And I agree entirely that Bills game's a throwaway. It's an unprecedented travel advantage that's literally never happened in NFL history before. So that, like you said, that's their best win, and it doesn't count if we're evaluating them going forward. The Titans, Josh, two mediocre games in a row from Will Levis. Tennessee couldn't do anything offensively against Tampa Bay. I'd go as far as to say this was a pretty bad loss to the Buccaneers. The Tampa held it, was in control the whole way. I think Levis definitely has some potential. The Titans' offensive line's a problem too. So having a rookie quarterback in his third start behind a below-average offensive line is something you gotta pay attention to, that kind of thing when you're evaluating these guys. But for now, Josh, what do you think about the Titans' offense?
Well, there was a lot of pushback on my viral Will Levis thread after his first game. As expected, anytime something goes viral, you're going to get a lot of people that hate whatever you didn't like in that. I was not super impressed with Will Levis's first game. And I'd like to say that after 3 games, I think it's starting to come together as to why. We're going to see a lot of inconsistency. The offensive line's doing him no favors. And I'm just going to be generally worried about all pieces of this Titans offense rest of season, kind of like we were when Tannehill was the quarterback. I think they should just stick with Will Levis rest of season. You have to see what you have in him. But not very optimistic about any of these options for fantasy football. The one guy that I think I'd be the least concerned about, though, is Derrick Henry. The Buccaneers' run defense has been kind of a bottom 3 matchup all season for running backs. And Henry himself has been very matchup specific, which makes sense. Not much of a pass catcher, old school run the ball type. And that's going to be really difficult when you have a bad offensive line going up against the Buccaneers. So I think this Jaguars game is, I wouldn't say it's this amazing bounce back spot, but I would start Henry in fantasy this next week, despite what we saw last week.
Let's see Larky tweets. Next up, Josh, the Commanders versus the Giants. Washington's a 10-point home favorite. Game total's 37 points. I have absolutely nothing to say about the Giants, Josh, so I'll leave that to you, but give you a few thoughts on the Commanders. In the first quarter of last week's game, I was sitting there thinking to myself, would I rather have Sam Howell or Geno Smith? And, I think the reality is I'd rather take my chances on Sam Howell right now, and I would have never thought that going into the season. That's not because not because I'm overly over the moon with Geno Smith. It's because Sam Howell's been much better than I expected. He was really good again last week. If you're going to go into next year with Howell, I think you have to give Bieniemy needs to be involved to some degree too. His decision to literally try to lead the league in passing attempts with Sam Howell was aggressive to say the least, but it's kind of sort of worked out, even though Washington's 4-6. One thing, Josh, I'm sure you noticed this because you're a data guy, really weird target distribution for Washington last week. I'm curious what your thoughts are on this offense.
Yeah, I'll just there's not too much to say about the Commanders that you didn't already say. It's a team pacing to lead the NFL not just lead the NFL, but set the NFL record for dropbacks in a season. We do love pass volume. It's why we are just starting Sam Howell pretty much each and every week in fantasy football. I do think the Brian Robinson 6 targets, 6 catch, 119-yard touchdown receiving stat line is the strangest individual stat line I've seen in 2023. What makes it even better is that Jahan Dotson didn't have a catch in this game. I know neither of us are big Dotson guys. Is that not the strangest one-off stat line, Ryan? 119 yards for Robinson when he had 60, which is half all of last season.
Yeah, I faced him in a season-long matchup, and I'm going to lose because of it. It was definitely that's a weird way to go out for a week, Josh.
On the Giants side, drop every single New York Giant not named Saquon Barkley. And Saquon Barkley, sell him. If you want to wait one more week, your trade deadline's in 2 weeks. Sure, he might do something. Might give you 15 fantasy points against the Commanders, who can't really stop anyone. Then you sell him. We talked about this pre-show. The way that I look at it, if I'm never going to play somebody in DFS the remainder of the season, I want to sell them in fantasy if they have value. How are you ever playing Saquon Barkley or any of these other New York Giants in any type of main slate tournament for DFS? I don't see how that's happening, and I don't want them on my teams. I don't see any way that I'm getting burned by just dropping off all of them. Darren Waller, IR, just let them evaporate, end up on somebody else's roster. And I think you'll probably thank me later for those anxiety relieving moves.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough to have a lot of upside when you score 17 points in garbage time, and that's almost a miracle. So I'm with you all the way there, Josh. Packers versus Chargers. Packers are 3-point home underdogs. Game total is 44 points. Perhaps the most bizarre takeaway from yesterday is like Herbert's getting the blame for the Chargers losing yesterday. They score 38 points. He had his best game in about a month, I'd say, where he essentially kept the Chargers alive against the Lions. Team still needs a real downfield threat, and it's Austin Eckler and Keenan Allen are both great players. So you can't say he has a limited supporting cast of skill players, but you're a Chargers fan, Josh. What do you think about Los Angeles?
Yeah, it's hard to say Herbert's the problem when he throws for 323 yards and 4 touchdowns, only throws 1 pick and doesn't take a sack all game. The way that I see it is kind of like what you said. The Chargers need a downfield threat. They wanted that with Quentin Johnston. It does not look like they have that to this point. And the defense simply cannot stop anyone. We've talked for weeks about how the Chargers are a great defense to target for quarterback streamers. Because of this, I think Jordan Love is going to fall into that bucket of hold your nose, and sometimes you can just start a player like this when the Chargers offense forces teams to try and compete against them, but their defense really can't stop anyone. I think it's been a mix of bad defensive scheme and then some bad signings. I think J.C. Jackson being the biggest one. You give a borderline record-setting cornerback contract, and then a year and a half in, he's no longer on the roster, and you basically got back a day 3 pick for him. The one other thing I'll talk about with the Chargers, Keenan Allen has been the best value fantasy receiver this year. Tyreek Hill has 25 fantasy points a game. That's number 1. The second best fantasy receiver this year has been A.J. Brown at 22.6. Keenan Allen is at 22.1, half a fantasy point per game lower than A.J. Brown. You were able to get Keenan Allen at the 3-4 turn in competitive leagues and in less competitive leagues. We talked about this with Yahoo and ESPN ADPs. Keenan Allen was a 5th and 6th round pick in those formats. And we were telling you guys to gobble him up, and it looks like he's going to continue to defy the age model where his skill set is going to age gracefully. Justin Herbert is one of the NFL's best quarterbacks still. And I'm going to continue to bet on Herbert, Allen, and Eckler on a weekly basis in this offense. And I think anything that happens with a Quentin Johnston is kind of icing on the cake at this point.
Let me ask you a question, Josh. Do you think Quentin Johnston's in very real danger of being this draft class's Sky Moore? Good draft capital, excellent offense, going to bomb anyway. Do you think that's on the table here?
I still think it is. I actually think the fantasy points for him have been a little bit deceiving. He's had double-digit fantasy points 2 of his past 3 games, but when you look at it, it's like, oh, there's no Mike Williams, there's no Josh Palmer. Last week even, Jalen Guyton outproduced him. Jalen Guyton. Yeah. He was literally not available in Showdown 2 weeks ago. DraftKings just didn't put him in the player pool, even though he was a starting receiver. That is how little the industry thinks of Jalen Guyton. So, yeah, I think Quentin Johnson at this point, I'm not quite ready to just say there's zero chance, but I think I'd say he looks like 80% of Sky Moore right now. Like I'm seeing the visions. He doesn't wear number 24 like Moore does. He wears a different helmet, but I think that's a good one. I'm seeing a lot, way too much Sky Moore and him.
Yeah, me too, man. Me too. Packers, I have nothing really positive to say about the offense. It continues to be what I expected. Turns out that life without Aaron Rodgers isn't pleasant for an offense. And, to that end, he's made a lot of coaches a lot of money over the years, skill position players too. Still, though, Josh, if this team's going to win games, it's through their defense. I like the Chargers this week. I'm going to probably consider them in one survivor pool entry, which I don't feel comfortable with, but I'm going to do it anyway. You have any positive vibes about the Packers here, Josh?
The only positive thing I can say is that I'll stream Jordan Love in a couple leagues this week against the Chargers. That's about it. Aaron Jones back in the committee with AJ Dillon. We don't like committee backs and bad offenses. And I think what we've seen with Christian Watson, Romeo Doubs, Jaden Reed is that generally 2 out of the 3 of them bust each week in fantasy football, and you don't know which 2. So I would try and get them off my roster. I hate anxiety-provoking fantasy decisions, and I do not like what I keep seeing from this Jordan Love offense.
Next up, Josh, 49ers versus Buccaneers. 49ers are 10.5-point home favorites. Game totals went from 42.5 down to 41.5 already this week. San Francisco showed that they're back. Purdy shredded the Jaguars. The Chase Young addition to the pass rush. The 49ers already had a terrific pass rush. Now they have like another blue chip athlete, which I think that's going to be a difference maker, especially down the playoffs. It's fascinating that the 49ers and the Eagles are the 2 teams that added difference-making defenders at the trade dedeadline. Maybe you guys should copy what the Eagles and the 49ers are doing from a roster building standpoint. Other teams in the league. Again, 49ers have been to 3 of the last 4 NFC championship games. They have the great roster. They have the pedigree, the coach, the talent. They have it all. What are you thinking about San Francisco's offense going forward, though, Josh?
I think the tough part with San Francisco is that, in a weird way, we kind of need one of their receivers to be injured to feel great about starting all of them. And I think that's kind of the one issue is that Christian McCaffrey always gets there. Good for him. But then with Brandon Ayuk, Deebo Samuel, George Kittle, when all 3 are healthy, it's a little tough to know who goes off in that matchup. They get moved around the formation quite a bit. It's so creative as an offense that you can't really just go, okay, we'll play matchups here. We've tried to do that before. We've often gotten burned this year doing that when all 3 are healthy. So I think for how good this offense is, we like McCaffrey. And then I think the guy we should like next most compared to the market, it's probably just Brock Purdy. Brock Purdy's looked quite good this year, and for fantasy, he's been very good. This offense is scoring 30-plus points almost every week. And just because we don't know who's going to do it, great. Just start the quarterback then. I think Purdy's kind of I'll say it like this. Brock Purdy is what we hoped Geno Smith would be for fantasy football this year. So Brock Purdy, congrats. Low-end fantasy quarterback 1 rest of season.
As Larky tweets, be sure to check out the 33rdteam.com tomorrow for Josh's fantasy rankings. They'll be out Tuesday afternoon. The Buccaneers, Josh, defense played very well last week after a meltdown against the Texans. Turns out maybe that's more about CJ Stroud than the Buccaneers defense. We'll keep our eyes on that. And I'll say this, Josh, you have to give Baker Mayfield some credit. I still don't like Baker Mayfield as much as many people do. This is probably the second best year he's ever had, though, which is kind of a backhanded compliment in some ways. Journeyman quarterbacks played for 4 teams in 3 years, but he lit up the Texans last week, carried the offense again this week, and albeit it in a 20-6 game. Is there any upside in Tampa Bay's offense going forward?
I think the upside is that it's consolidated. I think it's kind of an average offense overall, but the reason that we like them in fantasy is that it's really just Rachaad White, Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, and that's about it. That is very hard to find. If you're like the good version of this would be the Dolphins, where it's just Tua, Tyreek Hill, Jalen Waddle, and then whoever the starting running back is that week. We like the offenses that are consolidated. That's the best thing I'll say about them. Ryan, I'll pass this back to you. We wanted, we wanted to buy Rachaad White. We got that right. We were kind of leaning towards selling Mike Evans. That does not look good for us so far. Maybe we're 1-1. The 49ers have struggled this year against outside receivers for fantasy purposes, But I kind of have a hard time believing Baker Mayfield's going to have enough time to hit Mike Evans this week. Is that kind of where you're at? That despite what looks on paper like maybe a good matchup purely based on numbers, I'm going to be pretty below market, I think, actually, on Mike Evans for week 11.
Yeah, I don't think this is a good matchup for him specifically. You're right, especially with the upgraded 49ers pass rush. Tampa Bay's offensive line's been better than I expected, but I could see the wheels fall off the bus here myself. Next up, Josh, Bills and Jets. Bills are 7-point favorites. We'll see them tonight, 40.5-point game total. The Jets don't, Josh, I'm going to say this. I don't like Zach Wilson. He's one of my least favorite players to watch in the whole league. I've said that a few times. But I don't think Nathaniel Hackett's leaning into his strengths enough. I know that's shocking after what we saw what Hackett did with Russell Wilson last year, but Wilson's the kind of guy with his skill set. He's pretty good at a structure. He makes some pretty good off. His Hail Mary throw actually was a really good throw. To give you an example, like he moved left and threw the ball 40 yards downfield on a rope. He has talent, he has arm talent, but I think he could fit into the old school Mike Shanahan style offense, play action, roll him out, manufacture some completions. Instead, what the Jets are doing is they're continuing to be pass centric, even in a close game against the Raiders yesterday, which is mind blowing to me. And just having this guy try to beat people from the pocket when he hasn't been able to do that in his career to this point. So, while I don't think Wilson's the future at quarterback, I don't think the coaching staff's really helping him, and I think they got outcoached on both sides of the ball against the Raiders last week, actually. So, do you have any optimism for the Jets? And all? I know you like Breece Hall, but they're not leaning on him enough still, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say about Breece Hall. The Bills have struggled against receiving backs this year, so I think that really helps Breece Hall. I'm not concerned about the yards per carry. Some people are. I think that's kind of a product of Zach Wilson, more so than anything else. And then Garrett Wilson continues to show that were Aaron Rodgers there, we would have been right on the Jets as Super Bowl contenders. So I have very little positives to say. They might be the hardest team to watch in the NFL from the perspective of what if Rodgers had stayed healthy. So every time I watch this offense, I just think, man. Zach Wilson, backup quarterback, pretty steep downgrade from one of the 3 to 4 best ever to do it.
Yeah, to that end, Josh, the Jets are probably going to go on a losing streak here. So the idea of Aaron Rodgers coming back to like a 4-7 team or something like that is insane to me. Just let him rip at full strength next year. As he said, his problem is he needs to get up on his toes, on his heel. I saw Doc Flynn comment on this on Twitter, where she didn't come out and say this, but her stance seems to be that that's not a very good idea to test that right now. So I hope no one lets this guy come recover from an Achilles tear in 3 months at 40 years old and play in December for a team that's already out of it. Please don't do that. Next up, Rams versus Seahawks. The Rams were 3-point underdogs yesterday. They're 1.5-point underdogs today. Game total's up from 44 to 46. That sounds like betting markets think Matthew Stafford's going to play. This game ultimately boils down to him and his availability. And, the other thing is, Josh, is the Rams blew the doors off Seattle on opening day. We'll get to Seattle in a second, but what are your thoughts on the Rams?
Yeah, with the Rams, I think Stafford does play. Seems like everyone's excited about him. I'm going to be pretty excited about Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua. Everyone's starting to hate them because of 2 games. I think one of my favorite stacks for DFS this upcoming weekend might be Stafford with one of Kupp or Puka. I don't think anyone else is going to want to do that or tempt it, especially with Puka. Everyone's decided Puka is now a bust because of a couple games with a high target share but no production. And then Kyron Williams should return in week 12 off of injured reserve. This kind of gives Darrell Henderson one last chance. And I think a lot of people are going to be excited about that. And that's kind of why I'm going to go the opposite, lean on Stafford, who is just a much better player. And the matchup's just not very good for Henderson either. Seahawks have sneakily been one of the best run defenses. Really, the only time they got exposed was against the Ravens. But I think if there was a run attack that would be the hardest to game plan against, it might be the Ravens. So I'm willing to give them a pass from 2 games ago for them.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that at all. Geno Smith looked good from a production standpoint, Josh, but this is still a very unreliable offense. They just slipped by Sam Howell's Commanders at home. I have no confidence in the offense at all. And here's the thing, Josh. If they lose to the Rams this week, In week 12, 49ers on Thursday Night Football. The Cowboys on Thursday Night Football in Dallas the next week. At San Francisco again versus the Eagles over the next 4 games. The Seahawks could end up being below 500 if they don't win this week. So I think they're in genuine danger of that. What do you think about Seattle right now?
Yeah, not a lot of good stuff to say about the Seahawks. They shredded the Washington Commanders. Congratulations, everybody has. Kenneth Walker has now been out-snapped by Charbonnet for 3 straight weeks. I think you should sell high on him after a nice little performance this past week. And then Jackson Smith and Jigba looks like a sell. A sell. 2 of his past 3 games were under a 12% target share. And his average depth of target has continued to be abysmal. Week 8, his average depth of target was 0 yards. That is a running back. Week 9, his average depth of target was 6.5 yards. That is a tight end. Week 10, his average depth of target was behind the line of scrimmage. Again, a running back. The last 3 weeks, we have seen running back, tight end, running back. The Rams don't have a particularly strong defense. So maybe people out there are thinking, oh, it's JSN, but we hate this role. The only way that he can get there in fantasy is off of touchdowns or absolutely insane volume. And whenever Lockett and Metcalf are healthy, I don't see how that part happens. Tough for me to bet against Sean McVay at home coming off of a bye. I'm pretty concerned as well about the Seahawks offense.
That's Jay Larky tweets. Be sure to check out Nick Botiford's waiver wire comments on the 33rd.com right now. Also, Josh and I will be doing our waiver wire show tomorrow afternoon, where if you have a player like Geno Smith and you're scared to play him, maybe we'll give you some alternative options. Sunday Night Football, Josh. Broncos versus Vikings. Broncos are 2-point home favorites. Game total's 43. Now, Josh, I'm very happy at the 33rd team. Great quality of life job. Love everything about it. That said, I'm going to cold email the NFL to see if I can give them primetime games, 425 national games, because I can't take this anymore. I have absolutely no idea why the Broncos are playing the Vikings on Sunday Night Football. Where's the correlation there? Don't understand it at all. Denver, we'll see them tonight. Vikings first. Brian Flores has transformed this defense. This unit was getting smoked by Daniel Jones and Mac Jones last season, 300 yards. Everyone threw for over 300 yards against Minnesota. Completely transformed that defense. It's a big reason behind their success. Second, I think we said this in week 2, Josh. I said Josh Dobbs is going to end up getting paid 3 years, $33 million plus to be a long-term backup for someone. I think we're venturing into the territory where he's going to be more than that. That's great to see. I love Josh Dobbs. What he's doing right now is incredible. That said, Minnesota's schedule is pretty easy right now. It gets tough at the end of the year, so I wouldn't bank on it continuing. But again, can't say enough about him. Vikings are in the driver's seat for the 7th seed in the NFC. Also want to mention that Ty Chandler had a 29-yard touchdown run negated by a penalty. He's more explosive than Alexander Madison, who you hate, who maybe, I think he's hurt now too. So tell me about Chandler. Tell me about Dobbs. Tell me about Justin Jefferson. Tell me about the Vikings, Josh.
So Josh Dobbs will be maybe the biggest riser in my rest of season ranks that drop on Wednesday. He's been the quarterback 7 in fantasy points per game since week 2. He's had 25 or more fantasy points in both games with Minnesota. And that's without Justin Jefferson, who should return this week. So essentially, Josh Dobbs has already shown a nice fantasy ceiling without one of the 5 best skill players in the entire NFL in Justin Jefferson. Only Lamar Jackson has more rushing yards than Dobbs. We love that for the fantasy floor. If Dobbs is running at a pretty prolific clip, the skill group surrounding him is quite good. There's really not much to dislike, even with the schedule. If he were a pure pocket passer, I'd be more concerned with the schedule. But at least for fantasy purposes, if we know that he can run for 60 yards and a touchdown any given week, that just makes me feel so much better regardless of matchup. And then Ty Chandler has gotten very lucky, but we'll take it. Sometimes you take a little luck. Alexander Madison, we don't wish injuries on anyone. I hate that he got the concussion. This can affect them long term. But if we are just purely looking at Ty Chandler for fantasy football, this is the dream week for Ty Chandler. Ty Chandler woke up from a good dream to find out that he will be facing the Broncos' league worst run defense on a short week. Broncos play tonight. They will be on 6 days rest. So even though it's Sunday Night Football, it's still 6 days rest for the Broncos run defense. Ty Chandler should get pretty much all of the touches. Kene Nwangwu is just a borderline special teamer. I don't see how Ty Chandler isn't getting 15 to 20 touches. And we already know that he has breakaway speed. And we've seen this run defense time and time again for the Broncos get burned by quick running backs.
Let me ask you a question, Josh. Is Josh Dobbs who we were hoping Daniel Jones would be for fantasy purposes this year?
Okay, that is way too accurate and too painful for me to think about. But yes, that is kind of exactly the thesis behind 700 rushing yards last year from Daniel Jones. Josh Dobbs looks like he's pacing for around that number this year. Yeah, you get the low-end fantasy quarterback one where the passing stats don't quite look like they're there, and you look and you go, oh, this guy's running for 40 to 50 yards almost every single week and running in a few as well. Josh Dobbs this year's Daniel Jones. I love that.
He's been good, man. Good thing Cleveland traded him away. Monday Night Football, Chiefs versus Eagles. The spreads moved from Chiefs as 2.5-point home favorites to Chiefs 3-point favorites. I'm actually a little surprised by that. Game totals moved down from 48 to 46.5 points. In the Super Bowl last year, this I think applies to the Lamar Jackson talk we've had recently, is there's efficiency and there's production, and there needs to be a balance between the two. Yes, Patrick Mahomes is better than Jalen Hurts, and he was very efficient in the Super Bowl, made big plays when they counted. But Jalen Hurts essentially accounted for the entire Eagles offense in that game. So that's just a thing that I think about when handicapping games like this. Obviously, Mahomes is capable of carrying the offense, but Hurts is too, man. And, so far, the Chiefs' defense has been the star of the show for Kansas City. The offense has been good, but underwhelming for Mahomes' standard, which is, essentially winning the MVP of the league most years, at least contending for it. You have any? What do you think about the Chiefs' offense right now, Josh?
The Chiefs' offense has kind of been this wide receiver by committee approach. We don't really love that. What I do like is that the Eagles have really, really struggled against pass attacks this year. Patrick Mahomes is the best pure passer in the NFL. I'm going to be firing up Rashee Rice pretty confidently, especially coming off the bye. How do you not just give this guy a full-time role and a lot of targets? I think one of the things I'll be doing, especially in Showdown this week, is I'm going to have some Jerick McKinnon. I think he's kind of the sneaky flex play here for fantasy. Pacheco's going up against a buzzsaw in the league's best run defense overall. Jerick McKinnon, we know that down the stretch, he starts to get more work each of these years with the Chiefs. I think this could be the game where that happens. Potential trailing game script, just like we saw last year in the Super Bowl. So I think the two guys that'll be most excited to watch will actually be Rashee Rice and Jerick McKinnon for fantasy this week.
I like that. Last year in the Super Bowl, one of the reasons the Chiefs won is they had an excellent run-centric game plan at times, because you could run on Philly, and it's a tool to mitigate pass rushes. You cannot run on Philly this year, so the pivot to McKinnon makes sense to me from that standpoint too. On the Eagles front, Josh, revenge game. They definitely want this more than Kansas City. Eagles kind of thumped the Chiefs for the most part in the Super Bowl. That big hour-long halftime show. The Chiefs obviously have the experience. They handled that better. Punt return, wild dropped snap return for a touchdown for the Chiefs too, were the difference in that game. I think it's comfortable to say, let me know if you agree with this, Josh. Do the Eagles have a better roster than the Chiefs?
Yes, I think if you pluck the quarterbacks and swap them, this Eagles team goes 17-0.
I like that. I don't disagree, actually. Both teams are coming off a bye. I'd actually be kind of surprised if the Eagles don't win this game. What are your thoughts on Philly's offense, Josh?
We talked about it last week. It's worth repeating. We should be buying Devonta Smith. When Dallas Goedert's off the field, Dallas Goedert has a broken forearm. Smith actually has a slightly higher target share, 31%, than A.J. Brown. I wouldn't really expect Smith to consistently out-target A.J. Brown, but it's more the idea that Smith is a fantasy monster. He is a fantasy wide receiver one type. When we consolidate this offense just a tiny little bit in the pass game to purely A.J. Brown, Devonta Smith, if we think 35 routes a game, which is usually what these guys run, we have a 250 route, about 7-game sample without Goddard these past 2 years. And Devonta Smith, we can translate his fantasy production to 17 fantasy points per game. That's about a fantasy wide receiver 9, wide receiver 10 type production each year. The last thing I'll say about the Eagles, we'll close out the show on this. I think it's DeAndre Swift week. Chiefs have been more of a run funnel defense all season. People are souring on DeAndre Swift after 3 straight underwhelming performances. I think DeAndre Swift has a top 5 fantasy week and reminds everyone just how talented he is, and that this is what happens when you are the lead back in one of the best run games, and best overall offenses in football. Make sure you're checking out all of Ryan's work on the 33rdteam.com. He is Ryan Reynolds NFL on Twitter. Power rankings, survivor thoughts, how he's betting on each and every game. There is so much that he has to offer from a fantasy and betting perspective, and you need to be consuming all of his content. From Ryan Reynolds, from myself, Josh Larky, from the 33rd team, this is about to be week 11. Thank you, everyone.